A bar sat on the edge of town, surrounded by a dusty parking lot littered with cigarette butts and the occasional empty beer bottle. It was one of those places you could spot a mile away for what it was, a local hangout where outsiders were neither expected nor welcome. The neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, its letters spelling out Tommy's Tavern in a patchy, flickering glow. Private Malik Carter stood outside, his reflection dimly visible in the bar's grime-streaked window. His broad shoulders stretched the seams of his black bomber jacket, the military insignia on the chest catching the faint light. He hesitated for a moment, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag on his shoulder. "Just one drink," he muttered to himself, shaking off the creeping unease. He had just returned stateside from deployment and was on his way home to see his family. This was supposed to be a quick stop, a chance to sit down, relax, and celebrate his homecoming. The moment he stepped through the door, the noise in the bar dropped a notch. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence, and heads turned. Malik felt the weight of every eye on him as he made his way to the counter, his boots scuffing against the sticky wooden floor. "How can I help you?" the bartender asked, barely looking up as he wiped a glass with a rag. "I'll take a bourbon." "Neat," Malik said. He kept his voice steady, ignoring the hostile stares from the far corner of the room. That's where they were. The bikers. They called themselves the Iron Hammers, a group of rough-looking men who wore their leather jackets like armor. Their patches were unmistakable, a hammer smashing through a skull. Their leader, Buck, leaned back in his chair, a beer in one hand and a toothpick dangling from his lips. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Malik the moment he entered. "Look what the wind blew in," Buck said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few of his buddies chuckled, the sound low and menacing. Malik ignored him, keeping his focus on the bartender who slid the bourbon across the counter. "Thanks," Malik said, taking a seat on one of the stools. He sipped his drink, savoring the burn, and kept his posture relaxed. He had no intention of starting anything. But Buck wasn't going to let him off that easily. The Iron Hammer's corner of the bar was a hive of activity, their crude jokes and racist comments flying back and forth, as if Malik wasn't sitting less than 10 feet away. Malik could hear every word. "You'd think they'd know better than to wander in here," one of the bikers sneered. "Probably lost," another said, laughing. "Hey, soldier boy," Buck called out suddenly, his voice cutting through the din. "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this? Don't they have places for your kind?" The room went silent. Malik turned his head slowly, meeting Buck's gaze with calm, unwavering eyes. "Just having a drink," he said evenly. Buck leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Yeah? How about you take that drink and—" "That's enough, Buck," the bartender interrupted, his voice firm but nervous. "Don't start trouble." Buck laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, come on, Tommy. We're just having fun. Aren't we, soldier boy?" Malik didn't answer. He picked up his drink and took another slow sip, refusing to be baited. But Buck wasn't the type to back down. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and sauntered over to Malik. The other bikers followed, spreading out like a pack of wolves. "You got a name, soldier?" Buck asked, stopping just short of invading Malik's personal space. "Malik," he said. "Malik," Buck repeated, drawing the name out mockingly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Malik, you should know something about this place. We don't like strangers, and we sure as hell don't like—" "Buck!" Tommy barked from behind the bar. But Buck ignored him. He leaned in closer, his beer breath hot and sour. "People like you." Malik set his glass down carefully, the tension in the room coiling tighter with every second. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said quietly. "Trouble?" Buck said, feigning innocence. He looked over his shoulder at his gang, who chuckled darkly. "You hear that, boys? He thinks we're trouble." Malik's hands clenched into fists under the bar. His training drilled into him to remain calm, but his patience was wearing thin. "Why don't you finish your drink and get out of here?" Buck said, standing tall and puffing out his chest. "We don't want you around, soldier." The room held its breath. Everyone waited to see what Malik would do. Malik stood up slowly, towering over Buck by a good 3 inches. His voice was steady, measured. "I've had a long day, and I'm not in the mood for this. You're going to want to back off." Buck's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he sneered. Or what? You gonna make me? One of the bikers muttered, Buck? What? Buck snapped, turning to look at his buddy. That guy's military. You might not want to. I don't care what he is, Buck barked. Malik stepped forward, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over Buck. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the neon sign outside. Leave it alone, Buck, Tommy said again, more urgently this time. But before Buck could respond, the door to the bar swung open. Everyone turned to look. And there he was, Shaquille O'Neal. He ducked slightly to fit through the doorway, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire room. His presence was electrifying, a mix of easygoing charisma and raw physical power. The tension in the bar shattered like glass. Yo, what's up in here? Shaq said, his deep voice booming. The bikers stared, dumbfounded. Malik arched an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement breaking through his calm exterior. Buck took a step back, his confidence suddenly wavering. Who's trying to mess with my guy here? Shaq asked, striding over to Malik and offering him a fist bump. Malik hesitated for a second before bumping it, unable to suppress a small smile. Shaq turned to Buck, his towering presence making the biker look almost laughably small. What's your problem, man? The entire bar waited for Buck's response. For a moment, no one in the bar dared to breathe. The sheer presence of Shaquille O'Neal seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. At 7'1" and over 300 pounds, Shaq wasn't just tall, he was massive, built like a fortress. Even the rowdiest of the Iron Hammers hesitated, unsure how to respond. Buck's hand twitched at his side as if unsure whether to keep up his bravado or back down. The tension was thick, a coiled spring ready to snap. I said, Shaq repeated, his voice booming and carrying the weight of absolute authority. What's your problem, man? Buck chuckled nervously, the sound betraying the strain in his confidence. Ain't no problem, he said, raising his hands in mock innocence. Just having a little chat with the soldier here. No harm meant. Funny, Shaq said, crossing his arms and towering over Buck. Didn't look like no harm. Looked like a whole lot of disrespect. Buck's face flushed red. The Iron Hammers behind him shifted uncomfortably, their earlier swagger gone. You're reading too much into it, Buck muttered, but the arrogance was draining from his voice. Shaq took a slow step forward, his size making the movement feel deliberate and heavy. You know, I've got a lot of respect for soldiers. They serve this country so guys like you can hang out in places like this, run your mouth, and drink your cheap beer. Some of the bar patrons snickered quietly at the jab, but they quickly stifled it when Buck shot them a glare. Now, Shaq continued, you gonna apologize or am I gonna have to teach you some manners? The threat wasn't loud and it wasn't showy, but it landed like a hammer blow. Buck's eyes darted toward the door, calculating his options. I ain't apologizing for nothing, Buck spat, trying to reclaim his authority. Shaq sighed and shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. See, I was hoping you'd say that. He turned to Malik. Yo, Malik, right? You want me to handle this or you got it? Malik couldn't help but smirk, shaking his head slightly. I think I can manage. Shaq took a step back, gesturing grandly for Malik to take the floor. The bikers exchanged confused looks, as if they couldn't believe this was happening. Buck leaned closer to Malik, trying to reassert himself. You got something to say, boy? Malik didn't blink. Yeah, I do. The soldier's voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he stepped closer to Buck. He didn't raise his voice, but the power behind his words carried through the room. You don't know me, Malik said. You don't know where I've been, what I've done, or what I've had to fight for. But I'll tell you this. I've faced people tougher than you, in places a lot worse than this. So if you think for a second, I'm scared of you or your boys, you're wrong. The bar went silent again. Even Shaq looked impressed. Buck blinked, taken aback by the quiet intensity in Malik's tone. But he wasn't about to let himself be humiliated in front of his gang. You think you're better than us? Buck snarled, his voice rising. Just 'cause you got a uniform and some muscles, you think you can walk in here and act like you own the place? I'm not acting like I own anything, Malik said evenly. I'm just here to have a drink. You're the one making a scene. The calmness of Malik's voice only seemed to fuel Buck's rage. You know what, soldier boy? I think I've had about enough of your— That's enough, Shaq said, cutting him off with a booming voice. His face, which had been relaxed and playful up until now, hardened into a scowl. I let you run your mouth long enough, Shaq said, stepping forward again and placing himself between Malik and Buck. But here's what you need to understand. This guy? He pointed at Malik. He's 10 times the man you'll ever be. You want to mess with him? You're going to have to go through me first. The room seemed to tilt, the power dynamic shifting entirely in Shaq's favor. You really want to do this? Shaq asked, leaning in close to Buck. Because I guarantee you won't like how it ends. Buck clenched his fists, his knuckles going white. For a moment it looked like he might throw a punch. His pride was on the line, and the eyes of the entire bar were on him. But then he hesitated. The bikers behind him weren't backing him up. They were shuffling awkwardly, looking down at their boots or glancing toward the door. Without their support, Buck's confidence crumbled. Whatever, Buck muttered, stepping back. This place ain't worth the trouble. He shot Malik a final glare. Next time, you won't have your little bodyguard to save you. Shaq laughed, the sound loud and genuine. Next time? Man, you couldn't handle this time. The tension broke like a dam, and the bar erupted into relieved laughter and chatter. Even the bartender let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Buck stalked back to his corner, muttering curses under his breath. The rest of the Iron Hammers followed, their heads low. Shaq turned to Malik and clapped a massive hand on his shoulder. You handled yourself pretty good there, man. I just gave a little assist. Appreciate it, Malik said with a small smile. Hey, I don't like bullies, Shaq said. Never have. He turned to the bartender. Yo, Tommy, a round on me for the house, except them. He pointed a thumb at the bikers who were sulking in their corner. Tommy chuckled nervously but nodded. You got it, Shaq. The mood in the bar shifted. People started relaxing, conversations picking up again. Malik and Shaq found a table, and soon a couple of patrons came over to thank them for standing up to the bikers. But not everyone was convinced the Iron Hammers were done. Outside, Buck and his crew gathered near their bikes. Buck lit a cigarette, his hands shaking with anger. That big guy thinks he can humiliate us? Buck snarled, his voice low and venomous. We're not done. One of the bikers hesitated. Maybe we should let it go, Buck. He's Shaq, man, and the other one's military. We don't need this kind of heat. Buck's eyes blazed. I don't care who they are. Nobody makes me look like a fool and gets away with it. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Buck's authority held. He tossed his cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. Tonight, he said, his voice like steel, we show them who runs this town. Inside Tommy's tavern, the energy had shifted, but not entirely for the better. The tension that Shaq and Malik had momentarily diffused hadn't left the room. It had simply moved to the shadows. The Iron Hammers were back inside, and they brooded in their corner, their muttered voices like the rumble of a coming storm. Shaq, ever the showman, leaned back in his chair as if the room belonged to him. His booming laugh cut through the low hum of conversation, lightening the mood for those who hadn't left yet. You're telling me you walked straight through enemy territory, and all you cared about was saving a puppy? Shaq said, grinning at Malik. Malik smirked, shaking his head. The puppy was in the middle of a minefield. Had to clear it anyway. Figured, why not? Man, you're something else, Shaq said, shaking his head in disbelief. They should make a movie about you. Malik, the minefield hero. I'll executive produce. Malik chuckled quietly, but his eyes flicked to the corner of the room where the bikers were huddled. Their energy was palpable, coiled, hostile, and dangerous. They're not letting this go, Malik said under his breath, his tone serious. Shaq followed his gaze and sighed. Yeah, I can feel it. Guys like that always gotta save face. But don't worry, I've dealt with their type before. Malik's gaze lingered. I hope you're right. In the parking lot, The iron hammers gathered under the faint glow of the streetlights. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of gasoline. "They think they can walk in here, humiliate us, and just walk out?" Buck growled, pacing like a caged animal. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists. "They didn't exactly walk out yet," one of the bikers pointed out, kicking at the gravel. Buck spun around, his eyes narrowing. "Exactly. They're still there. And we're not going to let them walk out, period." "What's the plan, Buck?" another biker asked, shifting nervously. "We wait," Buck said, his voice low and steady. "When they leave, we hit 'em hard and fast. That big guy might look tough, but he's just some over-the-hill basketball player. And that soldier? He might know a few moves, but it's 6 of us against 2 of them." A couple of the bikers exchanged glances, their doubt evident. "You sure about this?" one of them asked. "If this goes south—" "It won't go south," Buck snapped. "We're the Iron Hammers. This is our town. We don't back down to anyone." The group fell silent, the weight of Buck's words settling over them. They weren't entirely convinced, but they'd follow him. They always did. Back inside, Shaq leaned on the table, his massive hands folded in front of him. "You know, Malik, I've been in a lot of situations where I had to stand up to people like them. Bullies, cowards. They all act the same. Loud, obnoxious, but deep down they're scared. They only come after you because they're trying to hide how small they feel." Malik nodded, but his expression was distant. "I've seen it before, too. People who act tough until they're faced with real consequences. The problem is, sometimes they're dangerous before they back off." Shaq tilted his head, studying Malik. "You're thinking about something." Malik hesitated before answering. "When I was overseas, there was this village we were stationed near. Local gangs ran it like their personal kingdom. One day, they decided to make an example out of a farmer who refused to pay their tax. Burned his house down. His whole family was inside." Shaq's expression grew somber. "People like that don't just back off," Malik continued. "You can't reason with them. You can't scare them. They only understand one thing." Shaq nodded slowly. "I get it. But we're not overseas now, man. And those guys out there?" He nodded toward the door. "They're not the kind of threat you've dealt with before. They're small time. Trust me." Malik gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue. The bartender approached cautiously, a tray of fresh drinks in hand. These are from the lady at the bar," he said, nodding toward a woman who gave a quick wave before returning to her conversation. Shaq laughed. "Man, I still got it." He picked up one of the glasses and raised it toward the woman in a playful toast. Malik smiled faintly, but his attention was still divided. His instincts told him something was off. It was close to midnight when Shaq and Malik decided to leave. The bar had emptied out significantly, the remaining patrons too absorbed in their drinks to notice the quiet undercurrent of danger. Outside, the air was crisp and biting. Malik adjusted his duffel bag on his shoulder, scanning the parking lot out of habit. "You always this tense?" Shaq asked, walking beside him with a casual stride. "Occupational hazard," Malik replied, his eyes narrowing. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as they approached their vehicles. Then, from the shadows, came a voice. "Hey, big guy." Both men turned toward the sound. Buck and his gang stepped out from behind a row of parked motorcycles, their faces illuminated by the dim light of a nearby street lamp. "You really think you can walk out of here after disrespecting us?" Buck asked, his voice low and venomous. Shaq sighed audibly. "Man, I knew you were dumb, but I didn't know you were this dumb." "You talk real big for someone who's about to get his ass handed to him," Buck said, stepping forward. Malik's stance shifted subtly, his training evident in the way he squared his shoulders and balanced his weight. "You don't want to do this," he said evenly. "Oh, but I do," Buck sneered. Before anyone could say another word, one of the bikers lunged at Malik, swinging a chain. Malik moved like lightning, stepping to the side and grabbing the chain mid-swing. With a sharp yank, he pulled the biker off balance, sending him sprawling onto the gravel. Shaq reacted just as quickly. When another biker rushed him with a bat, Shaq caught it in one massive hand and snapped it in two like it was a twig. "Y'all really don't learn, huh?" The parking lot erupted into chaos. The bikers attacked in pairs, trying to overwhelm their opponents with sheer numbers. But Malik and Shaq were a formidable team. Malik's movements were precise and calculated, every punch and kick designed to neutralize his opponent quickly. He ducked under a swing, delivering a sharp elbow to the ribs of one biker before spinning and landing a kick to another's knee. Shaq, on the other hand, was a force of nature. His sheer size and strength made him almost untouchable. He tossed one biker into a parked car with ease, the sound of the impact echoing through the lot. "Man, this feels like practice," Shaq joked as he blocked another swing and sent his attacker flying. The bikers were quickly realizing they were outmatched, but Buck wasn't giving up. He pulled a knife from his belt, his eyes locking onto Malik. "Watch out!" Shaq yelled. Malik turned just in time to see the blade coming toward him. The glint of Buck's knife caught the dim light as he lunged at Malik, the blade slicing through the air with dangerous precision. Malik reacted instinctively, twisting his body and grabbing Buck's wrist in a powerful grip. With a sharp twist, he forced the knife out of Buck's hand and sent it skidding across the gravel. "That's enough," Malik growled, his voice low and commanding. Buck grimaced, his pride more wounded than his wrist. But the fight wasn't going the way he'd planned. Around them, the other bikers were either groaning on the ground or stumbling back toward their motorcycles, thoroughly outmatched by the combination of Malik's military training and Shaq's sheer strength. "Had enough?" Shaq asked, his voice booming as he towered over one of the bikers who had tried to sneak up behind him. The man froze, his eyes wide with terror, and quickly raised his hands in surrender. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Shaq said, brushing imaginary dust off his jacket. Buck pulled away from Malik's grip and stumbled back, breathing hard. His face was flushed with humiliation, and his eyes burned with rage. "This ain't over," he spat, glaring at both Malik and Shaq. "You hear me? This ain't over." "It is if you're smart," Shaq said, stepping forward and pointing a massive finger at Buck. "But something tells me you're not." Buck hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of Shaq's stare. Finally, he turned and barked at his gang. "Let's go!" The Iron Hammers scrambled to their bikes, muttering curses as they revved their engines. Buck shot one last venomous glare at Malik and Shaq before peeling out of the parking lot, his tires kicking up a spray of gravel. The sound of motorcycles faded into the night, leaving the parking lot eerily quiet. Malik stood still for a moment, his body still tense from the fight. Slowly, he exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't think they're going to let this go." Shaq nodded, brushing his hands together like he'd just finished a pickup game. "Probably not. But next time, they're going to think twice before they try something." The two men exchanged a glance. There was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't over, and they both knew it. "You good?" Shaq asked, his tone softer now. "Yeah," Malik said, rolling his shoulder. "Nothing I haven't dealt with before." Shaq grinned. "Man, you're tough as nails. Respect." Malik allowed himself a small smile. "Thanks. You're not so bad yourself. Didn't know basketball players could handle themselves like that." "Hey," Shaq said, shrugging. "You don't survive as long as I have without learning how to throw a few elbows." They both laughed, the tension easing for a moment. Back inside Tommy's tavern, the mood was subdued, but heavy with curiosity. The remaining patrons who had stayed during the fight now whispered among themselves, glancing toward the door where Malik and Shaq had just re-entered. Tommy, the bartender, wiped down the counter with shaky hands. He looked up as the two men approached. "You guys okay?" "We're good," Shaq said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Those guys, on the other hand, not so much." Tommy managed a weak chuckle. "I appreciate you handling it outside. I don't need those kinds of messes in here." "Don't worry, Tommy," Shaq said with a wink. "We kept it clean, mostly." Malik leaned against the bar, his face serious. "Tommy, you've seen those guys before, haven't you? They hang around here a lot?" Tommy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the counter. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "The Iron Hammers have been coming around more often lately. They like to think they run this place. Most people just stay out of their way." "That's part of the problem," Malik said, his voice calm but firm. "Staying out of their way lets them think they can get away with anything." Tommy sighed. "I get it, man. But not everyone's like you. Not everyone's trained to handle guys like that. Most of us just want to get by without trouble." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. I get that, Tommy. But people like them, they only stop when someone stands up to them. You saw what just happened. They talk big, but when push comes to shove, they crumble. Tommy rubbed the back of his neck, looking conflicted. I hope you're right. I just don't want this place turning into a war zone. It won't, Malik said, his voice steady. Not if we make it clear this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. As the bar completely emptied out, Shaq and Malik stayed behind, nursing one last round of drinks. The adrenaline from the fight was wearing off, but the unease lingered. You think they'll come back? Malik asked, breaking the silence. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his large frame making the furniture creak. Probably. Guys like that don't know when to quit. But if they do come back, we'll be ready. Malik nodded, but his expression remained guarded. I've dealt with people like them before. Sometimes, standing up to them just makes them escalate. Yeah, but you can't let that stop you, Shaq said. If you back down now, you're giving them exactly what they want. They thrive on fear. Malik didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at his drink, his mind drifting back to memories of his time overseas. The dusty streets of foreign towns, the tension of never knowing when danger might strike, it all felt eerily familiar. I hear you, Malik said finally. But this is a small town. These people, they shouldn't have to live with this kind of tension. We need to find a way to stop it for good. Shaq's brow furrowed, and he nodded thoughtfully. Agreed. But first, let's get through tonight. Deal with tomorrow when it comes. Malik nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't over yet. Outside, the Iron Hammers had regrouped at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Buck stood by his bike, seething with rage. That big guy thinks he can embarrass me? He snarled, pacing back and forth. And that soldier? He's going to regret stepping into my town. The other bikers looked uneasy, their earlier confidence shaken by the fight. One of them, a wiry man named Lance, finally spoke up. Buck, maybe we should let it go. We got our asses handed to us tonight. If we go back now, we'll just lose again. Buck spun around, his eyes blazing. We're not going back to lose. We're going back to finish this. Lance hesitated. What are you saying? I'm saying, Buck growled, we take this up a notch. No more playing around. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a handgun, the black metal gleaming in the moonlight. The group fell silent, the weight of Buck's words settling over them like a shroud. This ends tonight, Buck said, his voice cold and final. The quiet streets of the small town stretched under a blanket of stars. The distant hum of crickets was the only sound as Malik and Shaq walked out of Tommy's tavern again. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel, the night air cool against their skin. Malik scanned the parking lot out of habit, his instincts sharpened from years of military training. Everything seemed still, but that only made him more cautious. You good? Shaq asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. Always, Malik replied, his eyes darting toward the rows of parked motorcycles near the edge of the lot. Shaq nodded, glancing toward the dimly lit street beyond the lot. You know, I could really use a burger right now. You hungry? Malik smirked. You're always hungry, huh? Shaq grinned. Man's gotta eat, especially after a workout like that. The two men shared a laugh, but the moment was short-lived. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Hey! Malik and Shaq turned toward the voice. Standing in the dim glow of the parking lot lights was Buck, his face twisted with rage. Behind him, the Iron Hammers emerged, their silhouettes menacing in the darkness. Well, well, Buck sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Didn't think we'd let you walk away that easy, did you? Shaq sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Man, I knew y'all were dumb, but this is just sad. The bikers spread out, forming a loose semicircle around Malik and Shaq. Most of them were well armed now, some with chains, bats, and one or two with crowbars. But it was the cold gleam of the gun in Buck's hand that caught Malik's attention. Buck, you don't want to do this, Malik said calmly, stepping slightly in front of Shaq. Oh, I think I do, Buck growled, waving the gun slightly. You embarrassed me in front of my crew, in my town. Now, I'm going to show you what happens when you mess with the iron hammers. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Man, you sound like a cartoon villain. You seriously think this is going to end well for you? Shut up! Buck snapped, pointing the gun at Shaq. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, some of them clearly second-guessing their leader's decision to escalate the situation. Buck, think about what you're doing, Malik said, his voice steady and firm. This isn't just some bar fight anymore. You pull that trigger, and your life is over. Buck hesitated for a moment, the weight of Malik's words causing him to falter. But his pride was too wounded to back down. You don't tell me what to do, Buck spat. You don't belong here, soldier boy, and neither does your oversized buddy. Before anyone could react, one of the bikers swung a chain at Shaq. Shaq ducked easily, his reflexes quick despite his size. Oh, y'all want to play dirty, huh? He said, grabbing the chain mid-swing and yanking it from the biker's hands. The sudden movement broke the tension, and chaos erupted in the parking lot. Malik moved like a soldier on the battlefield, his instincts taking over. He ducked under a swing from a crowbar and countered with a quick punch to the ribs, sending his attacker stumbling backward. Shaq, meanwhile, was a force of nature. He grabbed one biker by the collar and tossed him into another like they were rag dolls. Man, y'all are light work, he bellowed, his deep laugh echoing through the night. The bikers quickly realized they were outmatched, but Buck wasn't giving up. You're dead, Buck shouted, raising the gun. Gun! Malik barked, diving toward Buck just as the gun went off. The shot echoed through the parking lot, the sound sharp and deafening. The bullet missed, hitting the hood of a parked car instead. Malik tackled Buck to the ground, wrestling for control of the gun. Let it go, Malik growled, his grip like a vice on Buck's wrist. Buck struggled, but Malik's military training gave him the edge. With a sharp twist, he disarmed Buck and flung the gun across the gravel. One of the bikers lunged at Malik from behind, but Shaq intercepted him with a crushing tackle that sent the man sprawling. Stay down, Shaq roared, standing protectively over Malik. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shattered. Enough, Malik shouted, getting to his feet and glaring at the gang. His voice was like thunder, stopping everyone in their tracks. It's over. Go home before you do something you can't take back. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. Without their leader armed, they had no leverage. One by one, they backed off, retreating toward their motorcycles. Buck stayed on the ground, clutching his side and glaring up at Malik. This ain't over, Buck hissed. Yes, it is, Malik said firmly. Because next time, you won't just be dealing with me. You'll be dealing with the law. As if on cue, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights flashing in the distance. Someone around must have called the cops during the commotion. The bikers panicked, scrambling onto their bikes and revving their engines. Within seconds, they were peeling out of the lot, disappearing into the night. Shaq dusted off his hands and looked at Malik. You okay? Yeah, Malik said, breathing heavily. The first squad car pulled into the lot, and two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. What's going on here? One of them asked, scanning the scene. Malik raised his hands in a gesture of compliance. It's over. The guys you're looking for just took off. The officers looked between Malik and Shaq, noting the dented car hood and scattered weapons on the ground. Guessing you two are the good guys in this situation? One officer asked, his tone skeptical. Shaq flashed a winning smile. Come on, man. You know me. I'm Big Shaq. You think I'd be out here causing trouble? The officer blinked, then recognition dawned. Shaquille O'Neal? In the flesh, Shaq said, spreading his arms wide. The tension eased as the officers recognized Shaq and assessed the situation. We're going to need statements, the second officer said. Of course, Malik replied, already pulling out his ID. As the officers gathered information and took notes, Malik and Shaq leaned against a car, catching their breath. You know, Shaq said, glancing at Malik, I was just looking for a quiet drink tonight. Didn't think I'd be fighting a biker gang. Malik chuckled, shaking his head. Welcome to my world. You ever think about writing a book? Shaq asked, grinning. 'Cause I'd rad the hell out of it. Malik laughed, the sound carrying some of the tension away. Maybe one day. For now, they were alive, uninjured, and victorious. But both men knew this wasn't the end of the story. The police presence in the parking lot had done its job of scattering the bikers, but the tension in the air lingered. Malik and Shaq gave their statements, recounting the events with precision. The officers nodded along, jotting down notes while glancing occasionally at the imposing figure of Shaq and the calm, disciplined demeanor of Malik. "So, let me get this straight," said Officer Ramirez, her pen hovering over her notepad. "This group, Iron Hammers, you said, attacked you out of nowhere? No provocation?" "They were looking for trouble," Malik replied, his voice steady. "This isn't the first time they've harassed people around here, is it?" Ramirez exchanged a glance with her partner, Officer Jenkins. "No," Jenkins admitted. "We've had complaints about them for a while. Intimidation, property damage, a few minor assaults, but nobody ever presses charges. Because they're afraid," Malik said firmly. "And after tonight, they'll think they're untouchable unless you do something." Shaq stepped in, his deep voice carrying the weight of his presence. "Look, officers, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but it's clear these guys are a problem. You've got enough evidence now, right? Witnesses? It's time to shut them down." Jenkins sighed, scratching his head. "We'll do what we can, but without anyone willing to testify." Malik crossed his arms. "I'll testify." Shaq grinned. "Make that 2 witnesses." Ramirez looked at them both, her expression softening. "All right, we'll file the report and see what we can do. But if they come back, you need to call us immediately. Don't try to handle it yourselves." Shaq let out a hearty laugh. "Come on, officer. Do I look like someone who handles things quietly?" Ramirez smirked, shaking her head as she closed her notebook. After the police left, the parking lot returned to its eerie stillness. Malik and Shaq stood by their cars, the weight of the night settling over them. "You sure about testifying?" Shaq asked, leaning against the hood of his SUV. Malik nodded. "Someone has to. If they don't face consequences, they'll just keep doing this to the next guy who walks into that bar." Shaq studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're a good man, Malik. Brave. You remind me of some of my old coaches. Always about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is." "Appreciate that," Malik said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Shaq clapped him on the shoulder, the weight of his massive hand enough to make Malik chuckle. "All right, man. You ever need backup, you know who to call." They shared a laugh, but Malik's expression grew serious again. "You think they're really done?" Malik asked. Shaq tilted his head, considering the question. "Buck doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who knows when to quit, but he'll be back with a grudge, not a plan. Next time we'll be ready." Malik nodded, but a flicker of unease remained. Several miles away, Buck and the Iron Hammers regrouped at their usual hideout, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The dim light of a single hanging bulb cast long shadows over the group as they tended to their injuries and licked their wounds. Buck paced back and forth, his anger boiling over. "This ain't over," he snarled, slamming his fist into the wall. "That soldier and his giant friend think they can humiliate us in our own town?" Lance, one of the younger bikers, hesitated before speaking. "Buck, maybe we should just let it go. They're not worth it, man. And the cops are already on us." Buck spun on him, his face twisted with fury. "Let it go? Let it go?" His voice echoed through the empty warehouse. "Are you kidding me? If we back down now, we lose everything. Our rep, our control of this town, all of it." "But," Lance trailed off, his voice barely audible. "No buts!" Buck roared. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "We take them out, for good this time." Another biker, a hulking man nicknamed Tank, stepped forward. "You're talking about going after them again? With what? We already got our asses handed to us." Buck's eyes glinted with dark determination. "Not with fists this time." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle of fireworks. At first, the group looked confused, but then Buck opened the bundle to reveal several crude explosives. "This," Buck said, grinning wickedly, "is how we remind them who runs this town." Back in town, Malik was sitting in his car, staring at the darkened streets. His mind replayed the night's events, the adrenaline slowly fading into a deep sense of unease. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A message from Shaq. "You sure those guys are done? Got a bad feeling." Malik smirked and typed back. "I've got the same feeling. Stay alert." He put the phone down and started the engine. But as he drove toward his hotel, his instincts wouldn't let him relax. Something about Buck's eyes in that parking lot haunted him. Meanwhile, Shaq sat in his SUV, scrolling through his phone while parked at a gas station. His size made the vehicle seem small, but his presence still turned heads from passing customers. He glanced up just in time to see a black motorcycle speed past, its rider wearing a leather jacket with the unmistakable Iron Hammers logo. Shaq's expression darkened. "Here we go." At the warehouse, Buck and his crew loaded their bikes with makeshift explosives, their laughter echoing through the cavernous space. "This is it, boys," Buck said, mounting his bike. "We show them they messed with the wrong crew." The engines roared to life, and one by one, the Iron Hammers sped off into the night. But they didn't know that Shaq had already made a call to Malik. Malik's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He answered immediately, Shaq's voice urgent on the other end. "They're moving," Shaq said. "I just saw one of their guys riding out. Bet they're coming for round 3. Malik's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Then we'd better be ready." The rumble of motorcycles echoed through the still night as the Iron Hammers rode toward their target. Their plan was clear, an attack meant to intimidate and reclaim their dominance. But this wasn't a simple bar fight anymore. Buck's fury had pushed them into dangerous territory, and the stakes were higher than ever. Malik paced the length of the hotel parking lot, phone pressed tightly to his ear. His instincts had been right. Buck wasn't the kind of man to back down quietly. On the other end of the call, Shaq spoke quickly, his voice filled with urgency. "They've got something planned," Shaq said. "I saw one of them tearing down the street. I bet they're heading to you, or worse, back to the bar." Malik nodded, already considering his next move. "We need to stop them before anyone gets hurt. They're desperate now, and desperate people do stupid things." "I'm already on my way to you," Shaq said. "Sit tight, big fella. We'll figure this out." But Malik wasn't one to wait idly. His military training kicked in, and he scanned his surroundings, making note of potential cover points, exit routes, and anything that could be used in a confrontation. He stopped suddenly, his gaze locking onto a pair of headlights pulling into the lot. A black motorcycle rolled to a halt, the rider's face hidden beneath a helmet. Malik's posture stiffened. The rider dismounted slowly, removing their helmet to reveal Lance, one of the younger members of the Iron Hammers. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he held them up in a gesture of surrender. "Wait!" Lance called out, his voice cracking. "I'm not here to fight." Malik narrowed his eyes, but stayed where he was, ready for anything. "Then why are you here?" "They're gonna do something stupid," Lance blurted out. "Buck, he's lost it. He's got bombs, man. Real ones. They're heading to the bar right now." Malik's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, bombs?" "Homemade," Lance said quickly. "He's planning to blow the place up, scare everyone into submission." Malik's jaw tightened. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Shaq was calling back. "I need to stop him," Malik said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Malik met Shaq halfway to the bar, their vehicles pulling up alongside each other on the darkened road. Shaq rolled down his window, his expression serious. "Heard from Lance?" Shaq asked. "Yeah," Malik said, climbing into Shaq's SUV. "Buck's gone off the rails. We have to stop them before they hurt anyone." Shaq nodded, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel. "Let's roll." The drive was tense, the air between them thick with unspoken urgency. Shaq glanced over at Malik, his voice calm but resolute. "You've seen stuff like this before, haven't you?" Shaq asked. "More times than I'd like to admit," Malik replied, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "And you always handled it?" Malik looked at Shaq, his expression unreadable. "Not always." At Tommy's tavern, the few remaining patrons were enjoying a quiet drink, oblivious to the danger speeding toward them. Buck led the Iron Hammers into the parking lot, their bikes roaring like a pack of wild animals. Tommy looked up from behind the bar, his face paling as he spotted the gang through the window. "Not again," he muttered. The bikers dismounted quickly, Buck barking orders as they retrieved their crude explosives. "Nobody gets out unscathed tonight," Buck snarled, holding up a Molotov cocktail. "We'll burn this place to the ground if we have to." But before they could move, a loud voice boomed from behind them. "Hey!" The gang turned to see Shaq stepping out of his SUV, Malik right behind him. The pair stood tall, their presence commanding the entire lot. "You boys sure you want to go through with this?" Shaq asked, his tone deceptively light. Buck smirked, holding the Molotov high. "You're too late, big man. We're taking back what's ours." Malik stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're not taking anything but a trip to prison if you keep this up. Put it down, Buck." The bikers hesitated, glancing between Buck and the two men who had already bested them once. But Buck's pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Buck sneered at Malik. "You think your uniform makes you better than us? You don't belong here, soldier boy." Malik's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "What doesn't belong here is you threatening innocent people. This ends now." Buck laughed darkly, the Molotov still in his grip. "Or what? You gonna stop me?" Shaq stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the lot. "Oh, he'll stop you. But if you're lucky, he'll let me do it first." Buck's smirk faltered. "You think I'm scared of you?" "You should be," Shaq said, his voice like thunder. Buck's patience snapped, and he hurled the Molotov toward the bar. Time seemed to slow as the flaming bottle arced through the air. Malik moved instantly, sprinting forward and leaping into action. With a desperate dive, he caught the Molotov mid-flight, his gloved hand gripping the bottle's neck. He landed hard, but managed to snuff out the flames by smothering them in the dirt. The bikers froze, their leader's failed attempt shaking their confidence. "Now," Shaq said, stepping forward, "let's finish this." Malik and Shaq charged together, their combined strength and skill overwhelming the gang. Shaq used his sheer size to disarm and subdue multiple bikers at once, while Malik's military precision made quick work of anyone who tried to fight back. The fight was intense but brief, the bikers no match for their opponents. Buck, realizing he was alone, stumbled back toward his bike, desperation etched on his face. "You're done, Buck," Malik said, pinning him with a glare. Buck reached for another explosive, but Shaq grabbed his arm, lifting him off the ground with ease. "Nah, man, not today." Just as Buck hit the ground, red and blue lights filled the parking lot. The police arrived in force, quickly surrounding the scene. The officers took control, arresting Buck and his crew while securing the remaining explosives. Malik and Shaq stood off to the side, catching their breath as Officer Ramirez approached. "Didn't I tell you two not to handle this yourselves?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Shaq grinned. "What can I say? We're bad at following orders." Ramirez shook her head, but there was a hint of a smile on her face. As the bikers were loaded into squad cars, Malik and Shaq stood together, watching the chaos settle. "You think this is the last of them?" Malik asked. Shaq shrugged. "Maybe, but if they're dumb enough to come back, they'll know what's waiting for them." Malik nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for having my back tonight." Shaq clapped him on the shoulder. "Always, man, always." The chaos in the parking lot of Tommy's Tavern had finally settled. The police cruisers pulled away, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness as they carried the defeated Iron Hammers to jail. The quiet of the night returned, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. Malik leaned against Shaq's SUV, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His body still hummed with the residual adrenaline of the fight, but his mind was already processing the deeper implications of the night's events. Shaq stood beside him, sipping on a bottle of water one of the officers had handed him. He tilted his head, glancing at Malik. "You good?" Malik exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Yeah, just tired. This kind of thing shouldn't still be happening, you know?" Shaq nodded, his massive frame shifting slightly as he leaned against the vehicle. "I hear you. It's 2024, and we're still dealing with the same nonsense. But what you did tonight? That made a difference. Don't forget that. The door to Tommy's tavern creaked open, and Tommy himself stepped out, his face still pale but carrying a look of cautious gratitude. I don't even know how to thank you two, Tommy said, his voice trembling slightly. Those guys, they've been terrorizing this place for months. I never thought anyone would stand up to them. Malik turned toward him, his expression calm but resolute. You shouldn't have to put up with that, Tommy. No one should. Tommy nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. Yeah, but it's not easy, you know? People are scared. Buck and his crew, they made sure of that. Everyone thought it was better to keep their heads down than to fight back. Shaq stepped forward, his presence towering but comforting. Well, they don't have to be scared anymore. You saw what happened tonight. Bullies only have power when people let them. If this town stands up together, guys like Buck don't stand a chance. Tommy's eyes flicked up to Shaq, a flicker of hope breaking through his tired expression. You're right. Maybe this is the wake-up call we needed. Exactly, Shaq said with a grin. Now how about you put up a sign outside that says, "No bullies allowed"? Big letters. Make it clear. Tommy chuckled, the sound breaking some of the tension in the air. You got it, Shaq. The next morning, the events of the previous night spread quickly through the town. News of Malik and Shaq standing up to the Iron Hammers became the talk of every coffee shop, diner, and workplace. Tommy, true to his word, put up a sign outside the tavern. Tommy's Tavern, hate-free zone, all are welcome. The simple gesture resonated with the townsfolk. By the end of the week, other businesses followed suit, displaying their own versions of the sign. A few days later, the town held a gathering in the park to discuss how to move forward. Malik and Shaq were invited as guests of honor, their actions already being hailed as the spark for a broader movement in the community. The gathering drew an unexpectedly large crowd, people of all ages and backgrounds coming together to show solidarity. Malik stood at the edge of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention, but knowing it was important to be there. Shaq, on the other hand, thrived in the spotlight, shaking hands, signing autographs, and posing for photos. When it came time to speak, Shaq took the stage first. Y'all know I'm not from here, he began, his deep voice carrying easily over the crowd. But last week, I saw something in this town I don't see often enough. I saw courage. I saw a soldier who stood up against hate, not just for himself, but for all of you. That's the kind of spirit we need everywhere. The crowd erupted into applause, and Shaq waved them down with a grin. But don't think this is over just because a few jerks got taken to jail. This kind of change? It's on all of us. Stand up for each other. Look out for your neighbors. And never let fear decide how you live. He stepped back, gesturing for Malik to take the microphone. Malik hesitated, his nerves clear, but the encouraging nod from Shaq pushed him forward. He gripped the microphone tightly, his voice steady but soft. I'm not much of a speaker, he began, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. But I'll say this. I didn't stand up to those guys because I wanted to be a hero. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And because I know what it's like to be afraid, to feel like no one's got your back. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But we don't have to live like that. Not here, not anywhere. Change starts with each of us. So let's keep this going. Let's make sure what happened last week doesn't just stop with us. Let it spread. The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing through the park. Malik stepped back, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in a long time. As the crowd began to disperse, Malik and Shaq found a quiet spot to talk. Guess you're a public speaker now, Shaq teased, clapping Malik on the back. Don't get used to it, Malik replied with a grin. You sticking around? Shaq asked, his tone casual but curious. Malik shook his head. Got my family waiting on me. It's time I went home. But if this town needs me again, they'll know where to find me. Shaq nodded, extending a massive hand. It's been real, Malik. You're a good man. Don't forget it. Malik took Shaq's hand in a firm shake. Same to you. And thanks for having my back out there. Always, Shaq said with a smile. As Malik walked away, the sun setting behind him, he glanced back at Tommy's tavern one last time. The new sign outside glowed faintly in the evening light, a symbol of the change he and Shaq had helped inspire. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it.